The 68, the premier bracketology show in college basketball from the field of 68. I'm Greg Waddell. We are joined by Brad Wachtel making his debut on the bracketology side of things for the field of 68, and by Andy Bottoms, a veteran here on Fielding the 68. Andy, it's good to see you again, man. It's been almost, I want to say 10 months now since the last time you and I did one of these things. How you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Yeah, I think 10 months feels about right since it would have been last March. So lots has happened since then, but excited to get the show back up and running and be a part of it again.
It's that time of year, man. Things are heating up. And Brad, as I mentioned, this is your debut. Any first game jitters, any nerves with you today?
Not at all. I've been doing bracketology a long time. And this is the best time of year. And I'm excited to, reveal what we got.
I can't wait. So these two have provided their own individual seed lists that we have used to cultivate the official Field of 68 bracket that will be released on a weekly basis going forward the rest of the season. You can expect the very first bracket from the Field of 68 of the year to come out after this show is done. But first, gentlemen, let's start at the top, because I hosted After Dark last night. We had Terrence Oglesby, we had Geo Baker on, and we debated, is Alabama the best team in the sport right now? Is Purdue still up there? They've only lost once. We don't really know what to make of the top of the sport now that Houston goes down last night. Should Houston still remain at the number one spot? And look, number one in the polls is different from number one on the seed list. So I'm very excited to see who you both have as of January 23rd atop your overall list. Andy, let's go to you first. I guess in general, before we reveal your seed list, what goes into picking a number one overall team for you?
Yeah, it's not just as much as who you think the best team is, because I probably would have a different answer for who the best team is versus who I picked atop the seed list. But you're really looking at what they've accomplished so far. Focusing in on the quad 1, quad 2 records, looking at road and neutral, how they scheduled, different things like that, the various predictive and resume based metrics to try to throw it all in the blender and come out with what's the right answer. But yeah, it definitely doesn't have to correspond with what the polls are. It doesn't have to correspond with your own opinion of who you think the best team is. And as the IU guy, having to write in Purdue as at the top of that list is hurtful at best.
That one's got to sting a little bit. Brad, any pushback there? Anything you feel strongly about or differently than what Andy just told us?
No, I agree. I have Purdue at the top of my list as well. And really, you're comparing these teams and what they've done against, whether it's high Q1 and Q1. Purdue is 3-0 against high Q1 teams, and they're 7-1 against Q1 opponents. Typically, when you're looking at a team that's going to be the number one overall seed, you are looking for a team that's going to win their conference, at the top of their conference, which is where Purdue and Alabama is. But right now, they both have the number one and number two strength of record in the country. So it is really close. But Purdue does get the slight edge based on 9-1 Q1 and 2. And like I said, 3-0 high Q1. That's something that Alabama does not have.
Do you guys think that this is those two and there's some separation between the others at this point? I alluded to Houston, who I think prior to yesterday belonged in that group, but just going down the list here, a lot of other teams have taken hits recently that would be in that conversation. Tennessee had the loss to Kentucky. UCLA just had the loss at Arizona. UConn, it seems like they've lost everywhere in the last month until their most recent game. Is there separation? Is it Alabama and Purdue, and then a gap to the other teams that might be competing for a one seed right now? Brad, what do you think?
Yeah, I think there is a slight separation, but again, that could change after the next week. In my next tier, you could say there's Tennessee, Arizona, Kansas, and Houston. Houston was a one seed for a while, but they just suffered a Q3 loss yesterday to Temple. They're the only one seed that has a Q3 loss. So for me, that was a reason why they needed to be removed from the one seed line. And then you're looking at Tennessee, Kansas, and Arizona, and they're all very close. But for right now, I think those are the three teams that are fighting for the last number one seed.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think the gap has widened, and as Brad said, that can change a lot in a week. I don't think I would have answered that question nearly the same way as what I probably would have a week ago when I was putting together the bracket. So As he said, I think you've got those two that have risen to the top. Purdue is also 10-0 in road and neutral games, which is a huge, huge feather in their cap from that standpoint. But then those next four teams that Brad mentioned were really the other four to consider in that mix. And, I think as we talk more about this, I'm not sure we ended up in the same place with who we picked, but I think there's arguments to be made for and against each of those four, which probably speaks to how closely packed together they really are.
All right, before we go one by one and get both of your official top four seeds, I've got one other broader question here. The Big 12 has a bunch of good teams. I think a lot of people have sort of framed them as the best conference in college basketball this season. They have an argument that they could get 7, 8, even more than 8 teams into the NCAA tournament, potentially, depending on how things shake out. With that said, at the top of that conference, it's a bit of a mess right now with Kansas losing twice in the last week. I think if we had done the show a week ago, I would have expected both of you to have Kansas up in that top group as well, talking 1 seed territory. Who's the closest from the Big 12 group for you guys to inserting themselves into that conversation? Is it a team like Kansas State, who only has 2 losses on the season, that some of the advanced metrics don't love as much? Or is it still Kansas even after a couple losses? What do you got, Andy?
I've got Kansas State in the mix. I had them, I believe, as my last 2 seed. So they're, again, as you think about where there's separation from, groups of teams to another, they're not quite in that discussion yet with an Arizona or Tennessee, Houston to be on that one line. But they're the one that I have slightly ahead of Texas by virtue of winning at Texas. Head to head doesn't mean everything, but when you got teams that are pretty close together, it's a fairly effective way to break some of the ties. And I think what you look at with the Big 12 is you've got a ton of teams that are really in line or in contention for a protected seed. And then you compare that to a team like the Big 10 or a league like the Big 10, who's projected to get a lot of teams in, but there's hardly any that are protected seeds outside of Purdue. And it's just like between the 6 and 11 mark, it's just littered with Big 10 teams who are also beating up on each other. But I think you've started to see at least a little separation for now at the Big 12 to, where you've got maybe 5 or so teams really vying for a protected seed.
It hurts my soul to see you mention the Big 12 in such an accurate way at this point in the season. I'm looking forward to just seeing my heart get ripped out of my body as soon as we get to that first weekend in March. Brad, same question to you on the Big 12. Do you agree Kansas State is sort of ahead of the pack there as of today?
I do agree with Kansas State, obviously behind Kansas. I think the reason why Kansas State is separated from Texas and Baylor and Iowa State, they won at Texas. And they also beat Kansas. So those are 2 significant reasons why I believe they are ahead of them. They have a better strength of record, so their result-based metrics are a little bit better. But again, all of those teams are fairly close.
Yeah, I have a feeling we're going to see some movement in the next month in that conference as the bloodbath that is the Big 12 continues to play itself out. All right, Andy, let's go back to you. Give us your official 1 seeds as of today. Who are the 4 teams you've got at the top line?
Yeah, so I've got Purdue and Alabama, as we talked about earlier. And I had Kansas as 3rd, despite those couple losses. They're still 7-3 in quad 1, 4-0 in quad 2. Rank really well in the results-based metrics. And in terms of losses, they don't necessarily have a bad loss. It's all been to tournament teams. They've done some work on neutral floors, beating Duke, NC State, Wisconsin. There have won a few key road games. So I had them at 3rd, a little bit ahead of Tennessee. This was the last spot was an interesting one. It really came down to Tennessee and Arizona for me. Tennessee, the quality metrics are really, really good. When you look at their resume, they got that weird loss to Colorado, and otherwise, beat Kansas. That's really the biggest win that they have. They've once done some work on neutral courts, but just don't have a ton of marquee wins as you look at their overall schedule. But they're 8-2 road neutral. And 8-3 against the top 2 quadrants. So I had them edge out Arizona. The case for them is that they beat Tennessee at home is part of it. Resume metrics are good. 6-2 in the first quadrant, which is a really good mark. The head scratching part for them is the losses. All 3 losses are to teams that I guess Utah theoretically is in the conversation at least. for the tournament, but losing the teams that they've lost to have been a little bit head scratching compared to the other teams in line for the 1 seed. So that gave them, bumped them to the first spot on the 2 line for me. I wouldn't argue with anybody having them on the 1 line, and I think there's arguments to be made for Houston. They rank first in all the quality metrics. The challenge is that Q3 loss, as Brad said, nobody else really has that. And when you look at, even though they have 8 quad 1 and quad 2 wins, you really have 2 of those who came against teams that are firmly in the at-large conversation in beating St. Mary's and winning at Virginia, which is a great win. But just quantity of quality wins is going to be a challenge for them, and will continue to be a challenge for them over the remainder of the American, where they just have to win games. And then I think they play Memphis 2 of their last 5. There's really not a lot else they can do in the near term to move the needle other than stay atop the quality metrics and sit back and watch other people take losses.
Yeah, sustain feels like a word that comes to mind when I think of what Houston's future looks like. They're not necessarily going to do anything any given week to jump right back up to the top, but over the body of work, if they stay up at the top, if they do what is expected of a team with that talent in that conference, we could certainly find them back on the 1 line. Brad, let's go over to you. Let's see your official top 4 seeds. I hear a rumor that there may be a difference between yours and Andy's here. What do we got?
There is one difference. So I do have Arizona on my 1 seed line. I have Kansas as a 2. It is so close. It is so close. There's an argument to be made for all these teams. I mean, obviously Kansas leads the country in Q1 and 2 with the Q1 and 2 record with 11 wins. But when you start comparing all of these resumes, Arizona is 4-0 against high Q1 team, which is the best in the country. They also beat Tennessee and they beat UCLA, who in my mind is a 1 seed and a 2 seed. Tennessee, their predictive metrics are 2s and 3s across the board. They beat Kansas on a neutral court. I understand the committee they don't do head to head, but when it's so close like that, I think that's a reason to give Tennessee the slight edge. And that's why they're my other number 1 seed.
So I want to throw this back at Andy briefly because I'm just thinking in the Pac-12 here. Obviously, we had the big Arizona-UCLA game over the weekend. Would either one of you had UCLA on the 1 line prior to that loss? Like, if UCLA had won that game, are they a clear 1 line? Do they jump back into your top 4, Andy, whereas now you've got the Pac-12 out in favor of Kansas?
I probably would have made an argument to potentially have them over Tennessee. I think those are the 2 that I probably would have looked at. If you assume that UCLA beats Arizona, that's a high quality win, especially that because it was in Arizona. I think that would really vault them into that conversation. So they would have been right there. They'd probably be, if not the last 1 seed, they'd be right where Arizona is for me now, which is the first 2 seed. So, the challenge is similar to those teams, quite honestly, is what you talk about with the American in Houston. There really just aren't a lot of quality wins to be had. UCLA just traveled to both Arizona schools, and really until they get a return trip from them, there's maybe a couple opportunities to move the needle, but just not a lot. You got a lot of middling teams there. So I think it becomes, they're in much of Houston's mode of just maintain, rack up wins and kind of sit back and hope for a little bit of chaos around you.
And then, Brad, you did not have Kansas in your top 4. Did you have Kansas as the top 2 seed at this point?
Yes, they're my top 2 seed. And with regards to UCLA, had they won, it would have been close. I actually think I probably would have given the edge to Kansas. The issue with UCLA's resume for me is they have yet to pick up a high-end Q1 win. Obviously, at Arizona would be 1. That would be their first one. I think when comparing their resume to Kansas, though, Kansas still has more quality wins. Doesn't mean UCLA can't get to the 1 seed line. I think that's very doable. I know there's plenty of people that are picking them to win it all at this point in the season. But to this point, I think they're going to need some more quality high-end wins to get to that 1 seed line.
There's a big game tonight that could affect Kansas as well. Kansas on the road against Baylor, a place they have lost their last 2 games against Scott Drew's Bears. So something to watch for the team that is either the top 2 seed or the third 1 seed, depending on which of our experts here you listen to today. All right, let's move off of the 1 line Let's move to the more chaotic part of bracketology, gentlemen. Let's talk the bubble. And again, I'm a Big Ten guy, as we alluded to earlier. There's plenty of teams that I could ask you about in my world, and I think that applies to a lot of other college basketball fans. In this wide open year where nobody can seem to take a stranglehold on the sport, I think we're going to see that both at the top on the one line. I think we're also going to see that potentially on the bubble as we get to the stretch run closer to March, end of February time. There's going to be a lot of teams that feel like they're playing for their lives every single week in and week out. Let's go back to Andy here, and we'll reveal your last four in as of today. Who you got?
Well, as you might suspect, heavy Big Ten flavor in this part of the bracket. Two of my four are from the league, and I had, I think, 11 teams from the league in when I did my projections last week. 10 would have been there today. I don't really know that that's sustainable, particularly given how similar a lot of these teams are from a record perspective. But it is possible if they all kind of stay as close and as much in parity as they are today. But I had Northwestern as I guess the safest of the teams that were there. They have a rough week. They come off having a COVID and injury related pause. They play Wisconsin. I think they've got 4 games in the next 9 days: Wisconsin at Nebraska, Minnesota, and at Iowa. 2 of those games against, 2 of the lower teams in the league, but you also coming off that situation, trying to bounce back and rack up some more wins. So, but the good for them, they've got wins at home against Illinois and on the road against IU and Michigan State. So really a couple of solid road wins. No bad losses, although the margin of the Pitt game is questionable, but not a great non-conference strength of schedule. They got to get to a point where that doesn't really come into play. It's 290th right now. Kentucky is right there as well. They have certainly played better of late since that Tennessee game. But if you really look, they've got 1 win against a team in the field, and that's that game at Tennessee. Also beat Texas A&M over the weekend, who for me is still a little bit outside of the field, though I'm sure Buzz Williams is putting together some kind of dossier that he'll be able to present to us at the end of the season as to why that shouldn't be the case. But they've worked their way back into the mix there. Ohio State is there. This one I was waffling on a bit. Really good quality metrics, not so good resume metrics. And they bounced back at least by beating Iowa over the weekend. Certainly would not have been in had they not been able to win that game. They've got a few good wins there, mostly home and neutral court wins. Do have a win at Northwestern, so for bubble purposes that helps a bit. But losing to both Nebraska and Minnesota is not necessarily a recipe for getting where you want to get at the end of the season. And then I had USC as the last team in. Talked about the Pac-12 a little bit earlier. They picked up that nice win at Arizona State on Saturday. So that was enough to propel them into the field. Worst loss came to Florida Gulf Coast, which falls in Q3, but they're 5-5, road and neutral. But again, you kind of look at wins against the field. They've only got a couple at this point, Auburn and then beating Arizona State in that mix. So, none of these teams I would say has a firm grasp on a spot at this point by any stretch. And again, could kind of hear arguments for certainly the first team out that I had was the one that I had, gave the most thought to, but I think there's a couple other teams in that first 4 out section that could stake a claim to a bit as well.
Yeah, we'll get to both of these guys' first 4 out in just a minute. I just want to make note, seeing Ohio State in there, it's crazy to me because you mentioned how the quality metrics are so different than some other ways to evaluate this team right now. 19th on KenPom is Ohio State today, even as an 11-8 team. Going back last 5 years, there's been no team that ranked that highly on KenPom that has not made the NCAA tournament. In fact, you have to go all the way back to 2018 when Penn State ended up 19th at the end of the season post an NIT run all the way to the championship there. So very fascinating.
All right, now pleased
stuff.
to be joined by Indiana junior Trey Galloway.
I gotta ask you,
17 points in
Andy as well. Between the two at the top, Kentucky and Northwestern, didn't it just feel a little wrong having those two's graphics next to each other? I mean, the most average college basketball fan would look at that and not even believe what they're seeing with Northwestern 1 slot ahead of Kentucky right now, right?
A lot of storied basketball tradition between those two schools, obviously. Yeah, most of it lies on one side. If you combine their national championship, I mean, Northwestern has been an impressive story with Collins on the hot seat a bit and has played really well defensively. I don't know how possible it is for them to hang on. Like I said, the schedule gets not necessarily playing hard teams, but just now being able to have to try to make up those games is going to be really tricky. And so I think you look at a team that's a little bit depleted coming back off of that. I think this could be a key stretch for them that, if you drop one of those quote unquote bad games in that stretch, do you play yourself out? How are you able to recover from that? Because like I said, the non-conference strength of schedule doesn't leave a ton of room for error for them. And they've overcome that by playing well on the road and, 4-2 road and neutral, almost beat Auburn in a rock fight earlier in the season. That would have been another nice win for them to get, but they've been really competitive and certainly can, have a little bit more of a claim to a spot in the field than Kentucky at this point. If you don't look at the, some of the quality metrics and things like that, but if you actually look at who they beat, it's a lot more compelling case for them to make it in the field over Kentucky at this point, even though, again, kind of goes back a little bit to who you think's the better team versus who deserves to be in, that we talked about at the top of the bracket. Same thing happens on the bubble, and it's a lot more results based than opinion based at that point.
Right. Fascinating. And for anybody watching, we had a couple technical issues here. We've got Brad back, I believe. Are we still breathing, Brad? Everything good over there?
We're breathing. We're breathing.
We're good. We're live. All right. This is live production. This happens from time to time in this industry. It's okay. We just got Andy's last four in officially. He gave us the explanations of everything that was going on there. Let's jump back over to Brad now. Brad, can you reveal your last four in as of today?
Yes, I can. So my last four teams in, I have a similar set to Andy. I do have USC in. I have Penn State. I have Pittsburgh. And I have Kentucky. So when I'm looking at the bubble and I'm looking at trying to figure out who my last four teams in, first four teams out, what you need to do is figure out what separates these teams from other teams. So USC out of the Pac-12, they are 6-5 against Q1 and 2 opponents with a top 40 strength of record. Their win over Arizona State the other night got them into the field, in my opinion. No other team that's off the bubble right now, that's on the outside looking in, is over 500 against Q1 and 2 teams. So for me, that puts them above everybody else. Next, Penn State. Penn State has no bad losses, which, you might say no big deal, but it is a big deal because a lot of the teams on the bubble have a bad loss, a Q3 or a Q4 loss. Penn State also won at Illinois, which is one of those games, one of those wins. It's like, is it a really good win? Penn State, Illinois is kind of like a Jekyll and Hyde team. Got off to the strong start and then struggled for a while. Now it seems like, which way are they going to go? We don't know. But that seems to be a relatively strong win. Pittsburgh, after losing at home to Florida State, obviously, it's a bad loss. It's a quad 4 loss. It's their first bad loss of the season. Their net dropped about 15 spots. But when you compare them to other teams that are on the bubble, they're over 500 against high Q1 opponents. They're 2-1. And they're over 500 against Q1 opponents, which is 3-2. Not many people that are in the 8 through 11 range even have 2 high Q1 wins. So I think for me, that's enough to keep them in the field for now. I mean, the ACC obviously is not a great league, and there is a chance they could slip up again. They can ill afford another Q4 loss, that's for sure. But I do have them in as one of my last four teams in at the moment. And then lastly, Kentucky, my last team in. What separated them from other teams for me is their win at Tennessee. And I had elevated Tennessee to a 1 seed, so that win carries even more weight. As a result, they join the field for now.
So we've got agreement between Brad and Andy that as of today, Kentucky is in the last four in. A lot of work to be done for Cal and the Cats. I have one question for you, Brad. So looking at USC in that group, that's a team that early in the season but pretty unimpressive by my eye. And then last couple of weeks, things have really shifted. I don't want to say it's all due to this, but they got one of their 5-star bigs back, Vince Iwuchukwu, who did not play the first 10 games of the season. He looked great in the Arizona State win, 12 points, 5 rebounds off the bench. If he steps into a bigger role, I'm not sure if that's even going to happen this season, but if he gets to a point where, he's a force for this team in the starting lineup potentially, and they look like a completely different team, how will the committee look back on the first half of the season where they didn't have him? Is it easy to kind of just write some of that off and say, well, this is a new team now, let's look at who they are with him?
No, you don't write off the entire season without him, the first half of the season. Absolutely not. But you definitely take into account how they're playing with him in the lineup. And assuming, he's continuing to play as well as he has and is one of their better players, then yeah, that's going to be taken into account. I mean, there are a number of teams that are in a similar boat. I mean, even take a look at a team like TCU, who has a Q4 loss, but their Q4 loss came without a couple starters who were out. That is definitely going to be taken into account. So, the committee does take into account injuries. Do they take into account every single injury? I just think that's unrealistic. I don't think they do that. But when there's a significant injury that arises and the team's playing differently with that individual in the lineup, then that's going to be taken into account and will affect their seed.
All right, let's flip and go to some teams that their fan bases will be pretty upset to see them in this group. We're going to talk the first 4 out. Again, it's January 23rd. There's a long way to go. These teams could go all the way up the bracket. These teams could go all the way off the bubble in the next few weeks. Brad, we'll start with you this time, and then we'll go back to Andy, boomerang style here. Brad, who are your first 4 out?
First 4 teams out are Nevada. They're very close. They have a strong net, strong strength of record, but they're under 500 Q1 and 2. Even though they don't have any bad losses, they're lacking that really big win. And I know listed right there is tonight they play New Mexico at home, and in a game they're actually favored to win. That's the type of win that could boost them into the field. So, the Mountain West does have, more opportunities this year than they have in the past. So winning that game, they need to beat the top end teams in that league to get in that bid, but their metrics are good. Ohio State, I don't have in, even though they do have a really, really good net, their strength of record is bad. And that Q4 loss is a killer. And if you have a Q4 loss, you have to have something that can put you over the top. Ohio State doesn't have that. Their best win right now is against Rutgers at home in a questionable ending to that game, and a game they probably should have lost. They beat Iowa. They won at Northwestern. Decent wins, but not good enough to erase that Q4 loss. So they have a ways to go, but fortunately they play in the Big Ten, where it's the land of opportunity. Next, I have West Virginia, a team that you play in the Big 12, you have 0 bad losses, but 3-8 Q1 and 2 is bad. They're 0-6 against high Q1 teams. It's not quite good enough, but again, in the Big 12, they have the opportunity to make a move. And then finally, my last team out is Wake Forest, who have some solid wins on their resume, but they do have a 71 net with coupled with a bad loss. They're close. They play Pittsburgh next on the road. Getting that win will put them right there, right on the cut line, in my opinion.
Yeah, massive game tonight that you alluded to for Nevada. If they can win as a home favorite tonight, potentially get off of that last 4 in, maybe into the field. One to keep an eye on for sure. Let's go back to Andy here. Andy, give us your first 4 out.
Yeah, a lot of similar teams here, so I'll try to maybe hit some of the ones we haven't talked about as much. Penn State was my first team out. That was really the one that I thought most strongly about putting in the field. And that was one of the ones that Brad did have in there. So he talked about them. Challenge for them, 10 of their wins are in Q3 and Q4. Not a great non-conference strength of schedule, not quite as bad as what Northwestern's is, 3-4 in road and neutral. They do have that nice win at Illinois, though. So it'll be interesting. They've got an interesting schedule coming up. 3 of the next 4 on the road, including games at Rutgers, at Purdue, and at Nebraska, with a Michigan game at home squeezed in the middle there. Oklahoma, I had in there, which is one that we haven't talked about yet. They're a little bit like West Virginia, though, to be honest. They've gotten beaten up in Big 12 play. They are 5-4 in road neutral games, but they don't really have any wins versus the field. They did beat West Virginia when those two played head to head. That was in Norman, but yeah, not a ton of bad losses. Although, losing at Villanova is not what it normally is. They lost at home to Sam Houston, so those aren't great either. Few decent wins on the bubble, but overall really struggling, and their upcoming schedule is pretty rough as well, as is everybody's in the Big 12. I talked about West Virginia a little bit, nothing really to add for them, and then I had Nevada in that mix as well. The metrics are good from a net standpoint, from a resume-based metric standpoint, but as Brad said, really just not a signature win to really hang their hat on. Beating Boise State, Utah State at home is nice, but they need to do a little bit of work. Try to pick up a big win away from home as they go through things there. Don't have a truly bad loss. Lost at Loyola Marymount. That's a Q2 loss. So, but those are the ones I had. I think it's a pretty, set group of teams. Even Pitt, that Brad mentioned as one of his last four in, was, I think, the first team that was just clear of the last four in for me. So there's kind of this group of maybe 10 or so teams that are as much consensus as you can have right now. It feels like those are the ones that are right there around the cut line, give or take 5 spots.
Yeah, a lot of similarities here. We like that. I mean, we like controversy too. We like divisiveness every now and then, but from our bracketology experts here on Fielding the 68, we want a consensus. We want agreement, especially early in the season. That means we're on the right track, boys. So congratulations and kudos. I appreciate your efforts in putting this together. I have a little list here. We concocted this collectively before the show of some teams that may be polarizing in where they could land at this point in the season based on resume. So let's go one by one through these and just sort of speak to where you both have them. We don't have to spend too much time on it, but give us a couple sentences on how you see these teams right now. We'll start with New Mexico, who I alluded to earlier. They're on the road against Nevada tonight. New Mexico 18-2. They lost back-to-back games at the beginning of January. Other than that, they've been nearly flawless. A win at San Diego State just a couple weeks ago. Richard Pitino has these boys playing good basketball right now. Andy, where do you see the Lobos as of today?
Yeah, they're an interesting one for sure. I have them as an 8. I think they're a team that probably has a pretty wide range. The resume metrics are really good. The predictive metrics, not so much. They average about 54 in those. BPI is really high. At 72 there. Non-conference strength of schedule is almost 250. But they are 5-0 in Q1 and Q2. Both their losses, as you mentioned, came back-to-back, both fall in Q3. Winning at St. Mary's and at San Diego State definitely helps their case. So things to like. I think they're a team that's really hard to evaluate when you look at the record. They've got a couple of those really good wins, but a little bit tough to figure. I think you could put them as high as a 6, and maybe that's okay. I think you could even see him a little bit lower than an 8, and probably be able to make a reasonable argument for that as well.
All right, Brad, next on the list, we've got Creighton, team top 5 in the country preseason, started out 6-0, had the very close loss to Arizona, who, as we said, has played very well against some of the best teams in the country, then hit a bit of a tailspin. They lost Kalkbrenner for a period of time. They seem to have righted the ship a little bit in Big East play right now, but that record's sitting there at 11-8, and I'm not sure even the quality metrics love them right now. Where do you stand with Creighton today?
Now, I have Creighton as an 11 seed right now, 11-8 overall, 0-5 against high Q1 teams, 1-5 Q1. A lot of people picked them. Not a lot of people, maybe some people picked them preseason Final Four. And as you mentioned, they did have an injury. They lost a couple of games while Kalkbrenner was out, which that's another injury that will be taken into account. Their result-based metrics are poor, but their predictive metrics are very, very strong. They just got to get some wins now. They got to beat some top-end teams in their conference. They got to beat UConn, beat Marquette, beat Xavier, get some of those wins to really get their seed elevated, which they still have the possibility of doing that for sure. And if they don't, they're going to be one heck of a 10 or an 11 seed.
All right, let's go to Illinois next. I'm going to throw this back to Andy. I don't know that there's been a team that's been more up and down in the country than the Illini this season. Where do you stand on Illinois today?
I had them as a 6. I was debating between a 6 and a 7. with where they were. I think they were kind of right on the cut line of that. As you said, had those great moments on, beat UCLA, beat Texas on neutral floors. Those are huge games for teams that are firmly in the 2-3 seed mix as you look at them there. But, some of the losses, not a bad loss, not a loss to a team that's not either in the field or in contention. So in that regard, it's not bad. Just been really up and down and kind of a difficult team to really peg from a resume metric standpoint. They're not great. They're 40th in KPI, 43rd strength of record. So those numbers don't wow you, but the quality metrics still like them a decent amount, and the schedule was pretty good. So I think they're kind of safe, but I would guess in a committee room setting, they would have just as hard of a time kind of getting the finger on the pulse of what they really are in the same way that we do when we sit back and watch them.
For sure. Yeah, I know. Even Illini fans would tell you they don't know what to make of their team yet. Long way to go for Underwood and that group. Next up, a team that is all the way up to 7th on KenPom.com today. That's St. Mary's, 18-4. And all of a sudden, the West Coast Conference is starting to look like it might be winnable with the way Gonzaga's playing. Brad, how do you feel about the Gales? Where do you have these guys?
Currently have St. Mary's as a 5 seed. As you mentioned, their metrics are strong. They have a 6 net, which is ridiculous. They could be, another one of those teams where, maybe similar to New Mexico, there's a little bit of a range of what they could end up being seeded as. Getting a win over Gonzaga would be nice. I don't know if they don't beat Gonzaga. I'm not sure if they can get higher than a 5 seed. Maybe a 4 seed. I feel like they still need more depth. They need some more, meat on their resume. Their best win is San Diego State on a neutral court, which is a very good win. But it's not a high end win. They need some more to really remain in that 5 seed range.
Okay, so work to be done for the Gales. Potentially, like I said, maybe a conference championship for the first time in the while for them. That would definitely, I think, do wonders for them maybe as we head into the tournament. And then the final team here, let's move to the SEC. We've got Auburn, a team that I have no idea how I'm sitting here today and telling you this team is 16-3. I feel like that's one of the quietest 16-3 records in the country right now. They lost a bunch of talent from last year. They brought some key guys back, and Bruce Pearl has a group that kind of under the radar is winning games right now. Andy, where do you have the Tigers?
Yeah, just to hit back on St. Mary's real fast, I think it's one where, as Brad said, they're 6th in the net. I think you're hard pressed if you're the NCAA to really put them too far down the C list and essentially undermine the tool that you've got for sorting these teams. So regardless of maybe a lack of quality wins or some of those things, I continue to kind of push them up maybe a little bit even higher than I think they should be because of that. But with Auburn, they're one they look good in virtually all the metrics, both resume and predictive. But as you said, it feels like a quiet 16-3 mark, and they've got 7 wins that fall in Q2. And I think the thing when you look at them is they just don't have a ton of wins against. They don't have any wins really against high-end teams. They're wins over teams that are in the mix for an at-larger against Northwestern and Arkansas at home, as Arkansas started to fall off a little bit following some of the injuries. So you've got those couple wins and then a lot of good but maybe not great wins that look good when you look at a quad 1 and quad 2 record. But the reality is they're just not losing games at this point. And short of losing at Georgia, there's not really a quote unquote bad loss, and even that loss from a net perspective is not terrible. So they're the one that's just hard to peg. They just kind of keep climbing because they keep winning, but one that when you look at and try to evaluate who they beat and what all the numbers say about them, become a team that's a little bit hard to figure out where you really view them and how much you value the metrics over how good you really think the team might be.
Is it fair to call them paper tigers right now? Is that fair? I don't know. I'm going to go there. We'll see. All right, let's bring in producer Dagan here quickly because we appreciate our chat mob here on Fielding the 68.
We do.
Dagan, we got people popping off. What questions we got?
We do. MC Lee wants to know, can any of the top 3 in the Big East get to a 2 seed, or are they capped at the 3-4 line?
Yeah, I'll take it. I think they can get to I think they can get there. I think UConn is definitely capable of getting there. Have they righted the ship? If they go on and win the Big East tournament, I think they can get there. I think their metrics are very, very strong. Aside from them, I don't know about Marquette and Xavier. I think UConn's the one team, but they're going to have to play really well down the stretch for sure.
I think Xavier has an opportunity because they have so many of the tough games left on the road. Now, people have said that's allowed them to bank some wins and move their way up now that they played a lot of those at the Cintas Center. But if they can come away with some of those, road wins starting Wednesday at UConn, I could see them playing their way up to that at this point. I've got all three of the top teams back to back on my seed list, all right around that 4 range. So I think they could, but I would agree. I think UConn, with what they did out of conference, has the best chance if they can turn things around and get back on track.
Yeah, beating Alabama on a neutral court, I mean, that's as good of a win as anybody.
What else, Dagan?
I had them. They were trying to look and see what I had them. I think I had them as a 7 or an 8 this week. Pretty solid metrics all around. They're I think 6-5, so winning record against the top 2 quadrants. No losses outside of that is certainly a positive. Beating Duke at home and Miami at home are their biggest wins, and have a couple decent neutral court wins against Dayton and Butler. But I think if they can find a way to pick up a really strong ACC win on the road, I think that helps bolster their case a little bit. Wouldn't really say they have any bad losses, but they played a lot of the top teams at home and lost, or played a lot of the top teams on the road and lost. So that, kind of marquee road win is probably what's holding them back, but overall solidly in that 7-8 range for me.
How much can they improve? I'm looking just at their remaining schedule, right? They go at Virginia. Obviously, you win that game. That's a big shift. But like outside of that game, like their next 4 are all not great teams that might not even sniff the NIT. Like, is it just preservation for them in the ACC?
I think in terms of NC State, it's avoid the bad losses. They don't have any yet this season. If they can avoid that, their resume is solid enough where they might still be able to get in with what they got. Beat the teams you're supposed to beat, especially at home, and avoid Q3 and Q4 losses, and they should be okay. But like you said, I don't think their ceiling is very high.
Yeah, it seems like obviously you win at Virginia, that would definitely change some things. They still got North Carolina and Duke left, but just a lot of games that would potentially hurt them a lot more than they would help them. Dagan, give us one more, and then we're gonna get to our games to watch of the week.
Yeah, we'll do one quickly here. I think my mic was muted for the last one, so that was about NC State. I think my mic was muted for the broadcast, but obviously you guys heard it. Where do you guys have Clemson and Arkansas? I'll split that up so one can take 1 and 1.
Sure, I'll take Clemson. Clemson right now I have as a 9 seed. They're an interesting resume because they do have 2 Q4 losses. Their metrics aren't particularly great. Their predictive metrics aren't great. They are towards the top, at the top of the ACC. But what happens when they get another bad loss? If they get another bad loss, so they're in my mind. Once they relinquish the top seed in the ACC, they're in the bubble in the mix with everybody else, and they have plenty of work to be done.
And for Arkansas, they're a little bit the opposite of some of the injury questions that we had earlier, where you've got guys coming back and trying to evaluate what they look like. They've got guys that are missing, and their best wins for the most part have come when they were at full strength, which they are not going to be for the rest of the season. So they become a little bit more difficult to evaluate. They stopped the skid a little bit by being able to pick up a win over the weekend, but overall they're headed in the wrong direction, and lots of opportunities for them to prove that the current construct of their team can compete and win big games in the SEC, but they've got to get that part of it figured out, or the losses that they've had are going to be not necessarily held against them, but you can't necessarily sit there and say, well, you beat Creighton on a neutral floor when they were at full strength. What does that really mean when you're not at full strength either? So also, shout out to Dagan for showing restraint and not asking where Seton Hall was in the.
Don't worry. If they would have beat Marquette, it would 100% have happened. But we'll wait.
There's plenty of time for that, gentlemen. We've got roughly a little under 2 months left of this very show, 2 times a week, every Monday and Fridays, when you'll be able to catch Fielding Does 68, the bracketology show for the Field of 68 Media Network. All right, gentlemen, as we mentioned earlier in the show, keep an eye out. We will release our full bracket as soon as the show wraps. But first, our final segment of the evening. Give me some games to watch. Give me something that could move the needle for teams that you are particularly interested in keeping an eye on this week. Brad, let's start with you.
A couple games I'm looking at. Ohio State at Illinois, which is tomorrow. It's a road game, of course. Ohio State, in my opinion, they're one of my first 4 teams out. Win that game, they'll be back in my field. Another game is Oklahoma at TCU. Oklahoma, you want to get in the field, go win a road game at TCU. Easier said than done. But that's the opportunity that the Big 12 provides. And then, of course, as we mentioned earlier, New Mexico at Nevada. Really important game for Nevada. Need to hold serve at home. And if they do, they have a chance to break into the field.
Andy?
Yeah, a couple. I guess I'll stay on brand, stick with the Big Ten to a certain extent. A lot of Big Ten games of note. I know Brad mentioned Ohio State at Illinois. Penn State is a bubble team. They travel to Rutgers on Tuesday, which is an important one for them. If they can talk about them needing to pick up a really good road win, or another good road win, that would help. Wisconsin's got a couple road trips this week. Tyler Wall's back, so that helps them. But they go to Northwestern tonight, and then to Maryland later in the week. As you look at those, so I think those are big ones from a Big Ten perspective. And then going back to one of the questions we had about Kansas State or other when we talked about them earlier, they play at Iowa State on Tuesday, so that'd be a huge road win for them to pick up, and would one that could vault them back in. And then the other bubble will give the Pac-10 a little bit of love there. UCLA at USC, so USC playing better of late. Can they get a good win over UCLA on Thursday? That would certainly push them, give them a little bit of breathing room, at least as they sit in the last 4 in today.
Andy, that's not a Pac-12 game. That's a Big Ten game, my friend. USC,
I forgot.
UCLA?
I forgot. Man,
Come on.
I should have stuck with it. I could have hit only Big Ten games then. I totally whiffed on that.
Listen, I'm not complaining, but I mean, from a basketball fan perspective, we need all the help we can get right now. Yes, I'm claiming UCLA for this conference. Gentlemen, I appreciate all the work, the time and effort that goes into this. Everybody should be following you guys if they're not already. Let's just go around the horn real quick. Tell people where they can find your work. Let's start with you, Andy.
Yeah, it's at Andy Bottoms on Twitter. Brackets will be posted. Didn't do one this week. We'll do one next week on Inside the Hall for IU. And then for those who just can't get enough Big Ten basketball, IU postgame show after every game that I'm on. And actually, we got a women's postgame show that I'll be on tonight since the IU women are tearing it up. So mostly any IU site, I'm usually hanging around there, I would say.
Love it. I'm bringing the candy stripes to Bloomington this weekend, by the way, Andy. It's my first trip to Assembly Hall. So the candy stripe pants will be on, my friend. Just to let you know. Brad, where can people find you?
For me on Twitter, at Brad_Wachtel. I post all of my bracketology right there. You could also find it at factsandbracks.blogspot.com. But everything is right on my Twitter account. And hope you check it out.
All right, gentlemen, this was fun. Again, Fielding the 68 will be back on Friday, twice a week for the rest of the season. And keep an eye out for our full official bracket that will be released after the show. For Brad, for Andy, my name is Greg Waddell, and we will see you next time on Fielding the 68.